Canis Sapiens Unveiled, A Dog's Struggle for Acceptance and Equality. By Elton Gar. The crowd clapped respectfully, but not enthusiastically, as Becca walked onto the stage and jumped into the chair. She wore a tailor-made suit and square glasses designed to make her look more human, even though neither was as comfortable as something tailored for a dog's body type. As she ran across the stage, Becca focused on not wagging her tail. It was one of many accommodations to make her look less like a dog. Not that it helped. She looked like a dog someone had dressed up, but this was her chance to show people who she was. Her chance to make the case for why she and her family should be accepted by humans. She tried to ignore the crowd as the host had suggested. Being watched made her nervous. The lights helped because she shouldn't see most of the crowd, but unlike a human, she could smell each of the hundreds of people in the audience.
"It's good to see you,"
the talk show host said. They had barely spoken before the show, but she knew he was on her side, which was why she had picked this show.
"It is good to see you, and thank you for having me on your show,"
Rebecca said.
"For those people who don't know, could you tell us a little about yourself and where you come from?"
"Well, technically I'm a dog. A mutt, from a government laboratory. They were doing genetic research, testing the insertion of DNA from one animal to another. It worked better than they expected."
"So your brain is basically human,"
the man said.
"The structure is mostly that of a human brain, but there are differences. My instincts, for example, are those of a canine. You smile when you're happy. I wag my tail. You grow to maturity in about 18 years. I was fully mature in about 2.
"And that is necessary, because you have a shorter lifespan,"
the host said. It was one question that always came up. Humans lived 6 or 7 times longer than dogs, and that made humans uncomfortable.
"Considerably shorter. I'm about 10, which makes me fairly old."
"It would make you about 70 in dog years,"
the host said. Rebecca took a breath to calm herself and said,
"I'm not a fan of the term dog years. I know it's not intentionally derogatory, but it's also not accurate. A year for me is still 365 days.
"You're right, of course. But can you tell us about how you feel about having a shortened lifespan?"
the host said. Having to correct people was frustrating, but she understood. He was giving her the chance to tell everyone.
"It's not shortened. It's how long dogs live, but I think everyone, human or dog, would like to live longer,"
Rebecca said, though the truth was it felt shortened to her as well. She had spent her life around people who expected to live 10 times longer than she did, and the older she got, the more that bothered her.
"Has anyone discussed further genetic alterations? Perhaps they could extend the lifespan of your children."
"There are more ethics concerns when genetically altering someone who is intelligent. That's one of the major reasons they were tested on animals. We don't know enough to understand what other things changing our lifespans might affect. And honestly, it's not where I would start given the choice."
"What would you change?"
the host asked.
"Hands seem very useful, but altering the mouth would be even better. I had to have 3 surgeries before I could speak in a way that people could understand,"
Rebecca said.
"There have to be a lot of things that are difficult for you. The world simply wasn't made for you."
"There certainly are things more difficult for me than for humans, but I can also do things your people can't, and I've adapted or had things built for me to make up for most of my limitations. For example, I had a custom keyboard made that makes using a computer easier."
"What type of things can you do that humans can't?"
"I worked with the DEA for a couple of years finding drugs by scent. I quit because I have some concerns about the war on drugs. Personally, the thing I find most fulfilling is tracking people. A few years ago, I helped find a couple of kids lost in the woods. That was the best day. I can only imagine what it would be like to lose any of my own children."
"So you have children?"
2 litters. There were 4 in the first and 5 in the second,"
Becca said.
"And they're all as smart as you are?"
"Thankfully, yes. Though I'm pretty sure they think they're smarter. The genetic changes seemed to be dominant. They're all as smart as humans, But there are variations just like with humans, and there is a wide variation because each litter has a different father. We're the entire species of Canis Sapiens, and we'd like to limit any major genetic weaknesses as much as possible.
And has there been any discussion about what Canis Sapiens will do once there are more of you? Any plans to take over the world?
Rebecca laughed at that. A short barking laugh that she typically hid because it didn't sound human, but she also wanted to make sure everyone knew taking over the world was a joke.
We have no plans to take over anything, and there aren't enough of us to take over an apartment building. But beyond overwhelming numbers, humans have thumbs, which are fairly helpful. So I suppose my plans are the same as any parent. I want to make the world better for my children. And I think living peacefully with your people is best for both of us. My ancestors have been living with your people for longer than either of our species can remember, and I see no reason to stop. One of my sons is living with a nice family with a couple of kids. The children are old enough to take care of themselves, but not old enough to be unsupervised. I think there are a lot of families that would hire us for that sort of job. And we have the same skills as the dogs that already have jobs, so we might do a few of those.
So, do you think that your family will replace dogs in most jobs?
It is possible we will replace them entirely, as your people replace those who came before you. But whatever we do, it will take many generations. And there are ethical questions about bringing a child into the world under the current situation.
So, do you think it was unethical to create you?
I think it was unintentional. When I was born, the genetic altering process was far more crude than it is now. They were trying to improve my intelligence, but they were far more successful than they expected. That was an accident, but what is done now is a matter of laws and ethics. I'm not afraid of that discussion, but I think my people should have a say in what happens to us. And I certainly don't think it's fair to force us all to stay in one place and decide for us whether we should have puppies.
So, what do you think we should do?
I think I'm glad I exist, and diversity is a good thing. Still, I think the prudent thing to do is to limit new experimentation for some time and let us remain what we are for now.
I wish everyone else was as enlightened as you, but I suppose it is easier to accept people's differences when you're different. You've mentioned some people that don't like you much. Would you care to talk about that?
I'd rather not, but it's too important to ignore. I have no problem with the people, like the ones outside who are protesting, though some are exceptionally rude, and I'd prefer they didn't throw things at me. But even there, the angry people are a small minority. Most are kind, ethical people, worried about the implications of what is being done. And many of them are concerned about the health and safety of me and my family. The only real problem is those with power want to use us to keep power and to gain more, and for many, that means turning people against us.
That brings us back to the subject of the night. Congress is going to be voting on a law in the next few days that you're not pleased with.
I hope many people are displeased. They want to outlaw my entire species,
Rebecca said.
That's not how they describe it,
The host said.
No, they claim to be protecting people. Like when they rounded up the Japanese in World War II. 50 years later, we all agree it was wrong, but it's harder to understand that in the moment, and my family doesn't have 50 years for people to learn.
As I understand it, the law only outlaws genetic experimentation. You'll be free to do whatever you want. Hardly the same as being rounded up and put into camps.
They don't need to round us up. We all live in the same place. But the way the law is written, it can be easily read to say that anyone in my family having children is genetic experimentation. It's eugenics at best and genocide at worst. I'd just like to remind everyone who you're hurting before the law is passed.
Rebecca looked into the crowd for the first time as she spoke, to judge the impact of her words. She didn't want to push too hard, but it was important they understood. The lights made seeing the crowd difficult, and even with the glasses, her eyesight wasn't as good as most humans, but she saw something familiar. She then sniffed carefully, thinking through the many scents which she had been trying to ignore because it made her more nervous. It was the scent of Wendell Collins. Rebecca had a restraining order against him because he had kicked her during a protest. She hadn't been hurt badly, but it had become clear there was something wrong with him. Currently, he could go to jail just for being in this room, and he had stood up and was moving towards her. She could smell both fear and anger on him, and instinctively she understood that scent. He was about to attack. She dove behind the desk. As she did, she saw the weapon appear from out of Wendell's coat, and he fired 3 times. If she had been the size of a human, they would have hit. With no formal training, all she could do was rely on the instincts she had been trying to ignore her entire life. That terrified her, but people could be hurt, so she leapt out from behind the desk, grabbing his arm, digging her teeth into the flesh and allowing the full weight of her body to pull him to the ground. He tasted terrible, but her weight and the teeth worked. She twisted her head back and forth as the gun fell to the ground. Only then did she allow herself to bring her intellect back into the process. She kicked the gun away from Wendell's hand, then let go of his arm and said,
"Don't move."
He scrambled back about a foot, but that seemed mostly fear, and he didn't reach his feet, so she didn't attack again. She simply growled and waited for security. As she did, she realized the cameras were still on and calmed herself. She then looked into the camera and said,
"I've always wished I was human. I like humans. I feel human most of the time, but I'm not human and humans will never accept me or my children, so we can't pretend anymore. The laws and this attack are symptoms of the same thing. Humans are afraid, and when they give in to fear, they become angry and mean. But I also believe there is hope. Humans and dogs have worked together for as long as anyone can remember, and we will again in the future."
While the security secured Wendell, Rebecca moved off the stage. She slipped out of the building, moving through the crowd. As she went, she lowered her head and shook it with her glasses falling on the ground. She then shook off the human clothing. She felt a bit exposed with nothing but a collar on, but she'd missed the glasses more than the clothes. But she had known this time was coming for a while. And today was the day. She had spoken for her family one last time, and now they would all disappear. Without her clothing and glasses, she looked the same as any other dog wandering down the street. It was about 6 miles to the house of the cousin of one of the lab workers who she trusted. It was a small suburban house with a high wooden fence and nothing to make it stand out from any other house. The rest of her family had already disappeared, going to similar homes spread out across the country. And she had left a few things out of her interview. The most important was that all of her daughters were pregnant. There would be at least 10 more members of her species in the next months, and likely twice that number. She didn't expect to see any of her family again. She might pass a message along, but keeping everyone separate was safest, and her children were more focused on their own children than on their mother, as it should be. At the home, she found a doghouse in the backyard. It was luxurious for a doghouse, though beyond being bigger than a dog her size needed, the only real improvement was the thick flap of canvas that she had to push past and fell behind her. Once it slid shut, she found the small light hidden in the ceiling that she could turn on and a thick mattress. She would have to spend a lot of time here and lying around the yard in order to hide who she was, but then perhaps it was time to embrace that part of her as well. So she curled up on the mattress in the doghouse and fell asleep as she considered how she was going to learn to live like her ancestors without giving up on what made her who she was.
Author's note: I wrote this story with no intention of writing more. Sometimes a story just ends without everything being great, especially when it's a reflection of reality. But the story has stuck with me. I'm not sure if that says more about the story or more about the news. That said, I have decided to write at least one more short story that will be a loose sequel to this story. So if you enjoy this and want to see that story, you can join my newsletter and www.ansci-fi.com. You can get a free novel when signing up, and I give away a free story every week. If you'd like to help me write more of these stories, you can visit my Patreon. Thank you. Elton Gar.